The envelope was thin, just a quarterly statement from Premium Life Assurance, a policy I hadn't thought about in months because there was no reason to. But when I opened it, the numbers on the page didn't add up, and that single sheet of paper started a chain of events that ended with my sister-in-law in handcuffs, convicted of elder exploitation, her nursing license stripped, and a court-supervised special needs trust that I now control to protect my son forever. Let me tell you exactly how I dismantled her scheme, step by step, using every skill I'd ever learned, and a few I didn't know I had. My name is Claire, and for 22 years my entire life had been built around my son Lucas. He was born with a rare chromosomal microdeletion that left him profoundly intellectually disabled, completely nonverbal, and needing constant supervision for even the most basic tasks. Eating, bathing, wandering out the front door if you blinked. I was his full-time caregiver, his voice, his hands, his entire world. My husband Mark was a quiet architect, a man who drew straight lines on paper and held our fragile little universe together with the same steady precision. He died on a Wednesday. A brain aneurysm while he was driving home from work, his sedan drifting into a guardrail at 40 miles an hour before anyone even realized he was gone. No warning, no goodbyes, just a phone call from a hospital social worker that reshaped my entire existence into something smaller and colder and infinitely more frightening. Within a day, the vultures circled. Mark's younger sister, Renee, showed up at our house before I had even picked out a funeral suit, her husband Kyle in tow like a walking attaché case who'd learned to smile with too many teeth. Renee had always been the golden child in Mark's family, the one who could do no wrong, who drifted through a dozen careers before finally landing as a home health aide. When Lucas turned 15, she'd volunteered to be his respite aide a few hours a week, a role that gave her intimate access to our house, our routines, our financial documents. I never questioned it because family was family. But the morning after the memorial, as she and Kyle prowled through my home with clipboards and a strange proprietary air, something cold curled in the pit of my stomach. They weren't here to mourn, they were inventorying. I found myself drawn to Mark's study, a small room still smelling faintly of his cologne and the ammonia of old blueprints. Renee was in the doorway directing Kyle which boxes to label for donation, which papers to shred, her voice carrying that syrupy managerial tone she used with her elderly clients. When I pulled open the closet, her eyes flicked immediately to a dusty fireproof lockbox on the floor, maybe the size of a shoebox, gunmetal grey with a simple 3-digit dial. She wrinkled her nose as if it smelled. That old thing, it's been in the family forever, probably just Grandpa's expired insurance policies. Junk. Kyle, toss it. Kyle scooped it up without a second thought and carried it toward the garage garbage bin, and my heart thumped once hard against my ribs. I waited a few minutes, then excused myself to get some fresh air. By the time I returned from the garage, the lockbox was under my jacket, the cold metal pressed against my ribs like a secret heartbeat. I carried it up to my bedroom and set it on the nightstand and just stared at it for a long while, the glossy painted surface reflecting the dim lamp light, the dial worn smooth from years of use. Mark had never mentioned this box, not once in 2 decades, and the fact that he'd hidden it so deeply told me something important lived inside. Later that night, alone in my bedroom with the door locked and Lucas asleep in the next room, I sat on the edge of the bed and spun the tumblers to our wedding anniversary, 10-24-97. The lid popped open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Inside were the usual family documents, birth certificates, the title to a sedan we'd sold a decade ago, a savings bond from the Reagan era, a yellowed dog-eared photograph of Mark as a child holding a toy truck. But on the very top, folded into a tight square, was a piece of Mark's personal stationery, the thick cream stock he only used for letters that mattered. I unfolded it and his handwriting jumped out at me, that confident architectural script that always looked like it might design a cathedral. Claire, if you're reading this, I am gone. I don't know how or when, but I felt something shifting with Renee. She's been asking too many questions about our finances, about Lucas's care fund. I've taken steps to protect you both, steps I hope you never need to know about. But if things go wrong, do not trust Renee. She will destroy you. Save yourself and our son. Trust no one until you find the shield I built. I love you. The paper trembled in my hand. I read it 3 times, each pass carving the warning into my memory like a chisel. I didn't cry, the grief was still too mechanical for that. I just sat there in the dark, the lockbox's cold metal against my knee, understanding with absolute clarity that my husband had seen something I'd been too exhausted to notice. He had left me a weapon, now I just had to find it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that some family ties need to be cut with a lawyer. Now, back to the quiet war inside that house. The next morning the manipulation began in earnest. Renee sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea I didn't want and a manila folder thick with forms. Her voice had that practiced saccharine tone she used when charming elderly patients into signing over power of attorney. Claire, you've been through so much. Mark's death, the grief Lucas's needs. It's just too much for one person to handle. I want to help. Let me take care of the insurance paperwork, the financial stuff. You just focus on healing. Kyle nodded from the corner, his phone already out, thumb scrolling through what I suspected was a Zillow listing for my house. Renee slid a durable power of attorney form across the table, the kind that would give her broad authority over my assets and medical decisions, and crucially, Lucas's care arrangements. She framed it as temporary, a stopgap until I was back on my feet, and her smile never wavered. I saw the way her eyes kept dropping to the signature line, impatient, almost hungry, and I recognized that look from my decade of working in a hospital, the look of someone who sees the patient not as a person but as a transaction. I looked at her, this woman who'd always been Mark's pampered little sister, and I remembered the note folded in my pocket. I let my shoulders slump, my gaze drift unfocused over the steam from the tea, and I made my voice sound as foggy and helpless as I could manage. I don't know, Renee. My head is so foggy I can't even think straight. Can we talk about it later? I just need to rest. She patted my hand, barely hiding her impatience. Of course, sweetie, but we need to get this sorted soon. The insurance company has a deadline. There was no such deadline, and I knew it because I'd already been on the phone with them while standing in the cold garage, the representative confirming that there was no clock ticking on the policy at all. But I had just bought myself time. Over the next few days she kept pressing, showing up with different forms, an advance healthcare directive, a form to add her as a signatory on my checking account, a caregiver consent document that would have let her make medical decisions for Lucas without my input. Each time I played the grief-stricken widow, too muddled to sign anything, nodding along while she grew visibly frustrated, her knuckles whitening around the pen she kept offering me. Then she and Kyle pivoted to a new angle. I should move in with them. They'd care for Lucas and me under their roof, a beautiful gesture of family unity. They could convert the den into a proper bedroom for him, and we'd all support each other through this terrible tragedy. I saw the tactic for what it was instantly, a way to isolate me from any outside help, monitor my every move, and physically control the documents they needed signed. I agreed with a vacant, grateful nod, the helpless widow accepting a lifeline. I packed a single suitcase with clothes, my lockpick set hidden in a rolled pair of socks, and the lockbox inside a shopping bag with some of Lucas's favorite picture books on top. I coaxed him into the car with his weighted blanket and his worn stuffed elephant, and drove to their 4,000 square foot McMansion in the next town, a foreclosure flip with too many columns on the front porch. Every mile I put behind me, I promised myself I would turn their home into a trap. Living in Renee's house was like being a ghost in someone else's life. I was given a small guest room with a bathroom that smelled of lavender plug-in air fresheners and a window that looked onto the neighbor's privacy fence. Lucas was relegated to a converted den that had once been a home theater, now smelling faintly of popcorn and neglect, the blackout curtains still hanging from the previous owners. The first week I did nothing but observe. I sat in common areas crocheting a scarf I had no intention of finishing, a soft grey yarn that gave my hands something to do while my eyes and ears catalogued everything. Renee fielded phone calls she'd take in the hallway, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The first one I caught clearly was on my third morning there. I told you the balloon payment isn't due until next month. No, you cannot put a lien on the house. I'll have the funds liquid by the 15th. I already told you that. Then she'd hang up and smile at me like nothing happened. Another call a week later was with a credit card company about a delinquency on an account with a $27,000 balance, her voice tight and evasive, offering payment plans she clearly couldn't afford. Kyle spent hours in his home office with the door closed, his voice booming through the hollow core door as he tried to salvage a disastrous real estate deal involving a strip mall that had lost its anchor tenant, arguing with lenders about extension terms and interest rate caps. They'd bought a brand new Lexus SUV with a giant red ribbon on it 2 weeks after Mark's death, a detail that sat in my mind like a splinter. The insurance payout, my husband's careful planning for our son's lifetime care, was already being spent on a luxury vehicle while I picked lint off a 10-year-old cardigan that I'd mended twice already. The insurance statement had been the first crack, arriving a week before the funeral. It was a routine quarterly update on policy number PLA 78842B, marks $250,000 whole life policy, and it listed the death benefit, the cash value, and the current beneficiary. But instead of reading Claire H. Delaney, spouse, or the Lucas M. Delaney Special Needs Trust, the line read Renee A. Keller, sister. My blood had stopped. I'd called the insurance company from the garage that same day, my voice shaking as I recited the policy number. The representative, a tired-sounding woman named Greta, confirmed that a change of beneficiary form had been processed on March 14, 2 days before Mark's aneurysm. A substitution of beneficiary, she called it, signed by the policyholder. She emailed me a PDF of the filed form while I stood there in the cold garage, my breath misting, and I saw the signature, a credible facsimile of Mark's neat architectural cursive, the loops of the M and the slant of the K almost perfect, but the date was off. Mark had been out of town on March 14, at a building site 3 states away framing a medical office complex, and I had the hotel receipt in my email with timestamps and a check-in confirmation that put him 400 miles from the notary stamp Renee had somehow obtained. That form, sitting on my phone screen as I held the lockbox against my chest, had been the first piece of the puzzle. Now inside Renee's house, I had the missing context, my husband's warning, the specific suspicion he'd harbored, and a clear instruction to find the shield he'd built. I turned from passive observer to active investigator. I started a mental log of every red flag, keeping a small spiral notebook hidden in the pocket of my suitcase where no one would look. The Lexus's window sticker was still in the glove box when I checked it during a wrong key excuse. $72,000. A wine fridge in the kitchen was stocked with bottles that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. A Shadow Margaux that I looked up later at $600. A Screaming Eagle at over $1,000. The landscaping crew appeared twice a week to manicure hedges, the housekeeper came on Thursdays, and a brand new Sub-Zero refrigerator had been delivered the day after we moved in, its packing materials still stuffed in the garage next to a home equity line of credit statement with an alarming draw balance. And yet the tension was mounting. Renee's pacing at midnight became a regular event, her voice low and frantic on the phone, and Kyle shredded documents almost constantly now, the grinding sound a background rhythm I timed my movements to. The money wasn't infinite, and I suspected the insurance payout had already been partially drained in a spending spree, leaving them desperate for the next infusion. My breakthrough came on a Tuesday, courtesy of a burst pipe. The housekeeper had accidentally bumped a shut-off valve under the kitchen sink while reaching for a sponge, the old compression fitting failing, and a jet of steaming water sprayed across the Italian tile, the pressure strong enough to arc all the way to the Sub-Zero. Renee screamed for Kyle, who stood there uselessly with an adjustable wrench he'd grabbed from a drawer, but had no idea how to orient on the supply line, water pooling around his $1,000 loafers. I walked calmly to the garage, located a 10-inch aluminum pipe wrench and a roll of white Teflon tape from the toolbox I'd brought from home, that same red metal box with the dented corner I'd used for a decade. I knelt on the wet floor, shut off the hot water valve under the sink, and loosened the compression nut with the wrench. The old ferrule was cracked, a common failure on 30-year-old copper, so I slid it off, cleaned the pipe end with a rag, wrapped the threads clockwise with 3 layers of tape, snugged a new ferrule from my kit onto the pipe, and tightened everything back down until it was bone dry. It was muscle memory from my old life. Before I left the workforce to care for Lucas full-time, I'd been a maintenance technician at a large regional hospital, responsible for everything from HVAC filters to plumbing emergencies in the NICU, where premature babies couldn't afford a temperature fluctuation. I still remembered how to sweat copper pipe with a MAP gas torch, how to diagnose a faulty pressure regulator by its output gauge, how to pick a lock when a janitorial closet key went missing in the middle of a night shift, and a patient needed clean linens. Renee looked at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and something darker, more calculating as I stood up and wiped my hands on a rag. "I didn't know you could do that," she said, her voice carrying a seed of wariness now. I shrugged, letting my tone stay flat. "Just something you pick up when you manage a house for decades." That small moment of competence shifted the household dynamic. I was no longer just the helpless widow, I was someone who could see the cracks in their polished facade, and she knew it. The next day I noticed Renee's home office door was locked. It was a standard interior Harlow-core door with a cheap quickset key and knob lock, a basic pin tumbler mechanism with 5 pins and no security pins, exactly the kind of lock you could pick with a bobby pin, and a tension wrench if you knew what you were doing. I had a small leather lock-picking set in my go bag, a relic from my hospital days when we'd occasionally have to access medication rooms or supply closets during off hours, and the keys were missing. The set was a South Ord PXS-14, the picks with black metal handles and a variety of profiles, a short hook, a half diamond, a rake, and a double-ended tension wrench. I'd never thought I'd use it in a domestic setting, but as I stood in the dim hallway while Renee and Kyle were out at a business lunch, that I suspected was really a meeting with a bankruptcy attorney, I decided the time had come. I retrieved the slim leather case from the bottom of my suitcase, pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves from under the bathroom sink, and knelt by the office door. I inserted a short hook pick and the tension wrench into the keyway, applying gentle clockwise torque to the plug with my left index finger. A light touch is crucial, just enough to bind the first pin without seizing the core. I could feel the binding pin immediately, the one that was slightly tighter than the others, a tiny resistance that told me it was the first to set. I lifted it with the hook until I heard and felt the faint, satisfying click of the driver pin passing the shear line, that precise moment when the pin stack splits between the plug and the Bible. One by one I worked through the other 4 pins, each click a tiny confirmation that the lock was surrendering. The 4th pin was a bit stubborn, needing a little more lift, and I had to ease off the tension slightly to let it set without oversetting the first pin. The plug turned with a final snick, the dead latch retracting, and I slipped inside, closing the door behind me and relocking it with a quick turn of the thumb turn from the inside, so if they came back early I'd have warning. The room was dominated by a large glass-topped desk with a closed laptop, a corkboard covered in real estate flyers with red Sharpie markings about ROI, and a tall grey metal filing cabinet with a different lock, a tubular cam lock with a circular keyway and 7-pin alignments, the kind used on vending machines and bicycle locks. Tubular locks are trickier than pin tumblers because you can't easily feel individual pins. The circular keyway distributes the pins radially, and they all need to be set simultaneously while applying rotational torque. You need a specialized tool or a lot of patience. I had a tubular lock pick I'd made years ago from a champagne cork and a set of 7 feeler picks, essentially a 7-pronged probe that could simultaneously press all the pins while applying rotational force through the cork handle. I'd built it during a slow night shift when a nurse had lost the key to the controlled substance cabinet, and we'd had to wait 2 hours for a locksmith while a post-op patient's pain medication sat behind the glass. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. I slid the prongs into the keyway, the brass feelers aligning with each slot, and applied gentle clockwise pressure with the cork handle. The goal was to rock the pins gently, feeling for the one that was binding most tightly through the increased resistance on that prong, then gradually let the shear line catch as each pin set. I worked methodically, my ear close to the lock, listening for the subtle clicks that told me a pin had passed its shear line. The 3rd pin gave first, then the 5th, then the 1st. I had to release and reapply tension twice because the 7th pin was hanging up, a common issue with off-center drilled plugs, and it took 17 minutes of careful rocking and re-rocking, the sweat beading on my forehead, but eventually all 7 pins aligned, and the core turned with a deep, satisfying thunk. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, in a hanging folder labeled Mark Insurance in Renee's loopy handwriting, I found everything. The forged beneficiary change form was there, the original copy with its blue ink signature, the policy number PLA 78842B clearly typed in the header. I held it up to the light from the window and saw the telltale indentations of tracing paper, the slight wobble in the curves of the capital M, where Renee's hand had followed Mark's genuine signature from a birthday card I recognized, one I'd seen on her fridge a year ago. Behind it, a deposit slip from First National Bank dated March 30, showing a cashier's check for $250,000 deposited into account number ending in 4427, an account bearing Renee's name alone. There was also a letter from the insurance company, red-stamped urgent across the top, dated 2 weeks after the change, which requested verbal confirmation of the beneficiary alteration because the signature specimen on file didn't match the new form. It mentioned specific discrepancies, the line weight variance in the ink, the lack of the usual pen lift pattern in the letter A, and the fact that the notary stamp's ID number belonged to a notary whose commission had expired 6 months prior. That letter had been shredded. I found a plastic bag of shredded paper in the wastebasket, the long thin strips of a standard cross-cut shredder, about 1/4 inch wide. I tucked the bag under my arm, photographed every document with my phone, ensuring the serial numbers, account digits and dates were clearly legible, then replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, aligning the folder tab in the same slightly askew position. I wiped my prints off the cabinet handle, relocked both the filing cabinet and the office door with the same tools, and retreated to my room. That night, long after the house was quiet, I spread the shredded strips on a towel on the floor, armed with clear tape and a magnifying lamp, and spent 4 hours painstakingly matching the edges of the cross-cut pieces, the tiny geometric shapes that only fit together one way, until the letter was fully reconstructed. It was tedious work, aligning the fiber lines in the paper, matching the font fragments, but by 2 a.m. I had a complete, readable document. The text confirmed that the insurance company had flagged the signature as suspicious and had requested immediate clarification. But the payout had gone through anyway, because some junior claims processor, a temp named Dolores per the email footer I could barely make out, had overridden the alert due to a system workaround she'd been instructed to use for beneficiary changes under a certain dollar amount. That failure would later cost the insurer a 5-figure settlement. I now had enough to prove fraud, but I still needed to understand why the money hadn't already been locked down. Mark's note mentioned a shield he'd built, and I was determined to find it. 2 days later, while Renee and Kyle were distracted with a frantic call about a balloon payment on a second property I didn't know they owned, I carefully examined the lockbox again. Tucked inside the folds of Mark's note was a yellowed sticky note with a phone number and a name written in his block lettering. Callahan Estate Addy. I dialed the number from a prepaid burner phone I'd bought with cash at a gas station, my heart hammering so hard I could see the pulse in my vision. A receptionist put me through to a gravelly-voiced man named Arthur Callahan, who had handled Mark's estate planning for over a decade. When I explained who I was, he paused, then said, "I've been expecting your call. Mark updated his trust about a year ago. He came in specifically because he was concerned about Renee's financial instability and her increasing interest in his affairs. He suspected his sister might try something. I think you need to come in." The next afternoon, using the excuse of a long pharmacy run to pick up Lucas's seizure medication, I drove to a modest brick office building downtown and sat in a wood-paneled conference room while Callahan unsealed a thick binder. Inside was the irrevocable Lucas M. Delaney Special Needs Trust, created under 42 U.S.C. Section 1396 P.D. 4 and state law, with me as sole trustee. Mark had funded it with the life insurance policy, designating the trust as the primary beneficiary, a classification that supersedes any individual designation under the insurer's rules. The trust document contained a specific anti-capture clause he had written with Callahan's help, what Mark called the dead man's switch. It read, "In the event any person attempts to alter, remove, or reassign the policy beneficiary without a court order, and without the notarized, witnessed consent of the trustee, the entire benefit shall vest irrevocably in the trust, and the insurance company's legal department shall be required to freeze all disbursements and initiate a formal fraud review." Renee's forged form, processed in error and without my consent, had triggered that very clause automatically the moment the insurer's system logged the change. The money had already been frozen at the institutional level, unbeknownst to her, because the trust's existence and this rider had been omitted from the insurer's standard beneficiary change checklist, thanks to an older filing system that kept trust riders in a separate physical binder not all processors checked. The $250,000 she'd deposited was stolen property, and the bank, once notified, would claw it back via a restitution lien under the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act. Callahan also opened a second file, his expression grim. "Renee Keller has been under investigation by the state's Elder and Dependent Adult Exploitation Unit for 18 months, unrelated to your case. They've been building a pattern, skimming from vulnerable clients, inflating her hours, forging timesheets for services never rendered with her home health agency. Your evidence could be the final nail that consolidates a dozen smaller cases into one felony prosecution." He asked me to continue gathering material, to document every incriminating conversation I overheard, and to wait for the right moment to spring the trap. I agreed, a cold clarity settling over me. I wasn't just defending my son anymore. I was now a cooperating witness in a federal investigation, and I intended to hand Renee over with a perfect, airtight case. I decided to test Renee's humanity, to see if there was any crumb of family left beneath the schemes. I staged a collapse. One evening, while Renee was on the phone with Kyle about a loan modification for the house that threatened to trigger a balloon payment if they didn't bring current the overdue amount by the end of the week, I stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the granite counter. I let my knuckles go white, my breathing become shallow and ragged, and then I let myself slump to the floor with a heavy, boneless thud, my head bouncing lightly on the tile, my body splayed at an unnatural angle near the sub-zero. I lay there, eyes closed, breath held in a way that was barely perceptible, arms bent like I'd crumpled. Renee didn't pause her call, her voice didn't even hitch. I heard through the hum of the refrigerator compressor her words. No, the interest-only period is over. That's why we need the deed in lieu to clear the lien before the sheriff's sale. Yes, I have the documents right here. Her footsteps echoed on the tile, and through a tiny slit of vision I saw her loafer step directly over my outstretched wrist, the leather sole brushing my skin, as she reached the counter to grab a manila folder. She walked out of the kitchen while still talking, and the door to the office clicked shut. I lay there for a full minute, the cold from the floor seeping into my bones, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, a single tear tracing down my temple not from sadness but from the absolute clinical realization that the life of her sister-in-law meant less to her than the lien release percentage she was negotiating. When I finally sat up, I felt no anger, no sorrow, just a surgical detachment, the last frayed thread of family loyalty dissolved in that moment. I was going to see her destroyed, and I was going to sleep soundly that night. The confrontation arrived sooner than I expected, because Renee's financial house of cards began collapsing. The insurer's legal department sent a certified letter, which I saw arrive but she intercepted, freezing the policy payout formally and demanding repayment of the improperly disbursed funds under threat of litigation. She panicked. She and Kyle cornered me in their vaulted living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows, their fake smiles strained to the point of cracking. Kyle did the talking this time, his words smooth and oily. "Claire, there's been a little misunderstanding with the insurance company, a clerical error about the beneficiary designation. It's nothing serious, but we need to go to the bank and sign a few documents to straighten it out so the funds can be released, and we can continue providing for Lucas without interruption. It's just a routine transfer authorization. Nothing to worry about." I nodded along, playing the compliant widow one last time, my hands folded demurely in my lap. They drove me to First National Bank downtown, Lucas left with a sitter at their house, and my burner phone was tucked deep in my pocket with Callahan's number pre-dialed, and the compliance officer Sandra Ortiz's direct line already texted with a single word. Now. Inside the bank, a loan officer named Miriam led us to a private office with frosted glass walls overlooking the main lobby. Renee had already arranged a trust fund transfer authorization form that would move the entire remaining balance from the Lucas M. Delaney Special Needs Trust into a joint checking account she and I would supposedly share for Lucas's care. It was a standard ACH transfer request, pre-filled with the trust's account number at a regional brokerage, the routing number for the receiving account at First National, and a signature line for me as trustee. All I had to do was sign. The pen was placed in front of me, a heavy silver ballpoint with the bank's logo, the sort that costs a bank about $60 to order in bulk. Renee's smile was brittle as eggshells, and Kyle's fingers drummed on the arm of his chair. I looked at the form, then at Miriam, then through the frosted glass wall where I could see two men in dark suits standing near the loan officer's desk, their posture unmistakably official. I pushed the pen away with my index finger and folded my hands on the table. My voice was even quiet enough that only Renee could hear every syllable. "I won't sign away my son's future. The trust is ironclad. The fraud has already been reported to the authorities, Renee. The money was frozen the moment you forged Mark's signature." Renee's face contorted through shock, rage, then a mask of wounded innocence, a rapid cycling of masks. "What are you talking about? This is just a formality, you stupid woman. Sign it. Sign it right now or I'll make sure Lucas ends up in a state facility where he belongs." She reached for the pen, but I slid it into my pocket. At that exact moment the office door opened, and Arthur Callahan walked in, flanked by two detectives from the state's insurance fraud division and a bank compliance officer with a name tag that read Sandra Ortiz, VP. One of the detectives, a woman with a severe haircut and a badge clipped to her belt, placed a firm hand on Renee's shoulder. "Renee Keller, you are under arrest for felony forgery, fraud and financial exploitation of a dependent adult. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Kyle tried to slide out the side door but was intercepted by a uniformed officer who'd been waiting in the lobby and placed in handcuffs. The bank's fraud management system, overseen by Sandra Ortiz, had flagged the ACH transfer request the instant it was entered into the system, because the trust account's freeze note had been communicated to the bank via a safeguard alert under Regulation E, giving the bank legal authority to block the transaction and notify law enforcement. They had been monitoring my burner phone's location and the account in real time. Renee's face went white, then crimson. She lunged toward me, spitting curses as her handcuffs rattled. "This is all a misunderstanding. My brother would have wanted me to have that money. Claire is delusional. She belongs in a facility alongside her defective son. I'll sue you for everything you have, and then I'll sue you again." The detective pulled her back and recited Miranda again in a steady drone, while Renee's voice rose to a scream that carried through the glass walls and caused the tellers to freeze at their stations. I stood up, my legs steady, and watched them lead her out past the gawking customers. The last thing I saw was her mouth moving, a silent stream of vitriol I couldn't hear through the glass, and Kyle's face ashen as he was walked to a separate cruiser. I remained in the office with Callahan and Ortiz, filling out a formal statement, my handwriting perfectly steady, because I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. The aftermath was methodical and in its own way deeply satisfying. The state's case against Renee was overwhelming. I provided my photographs of the forged documents, the reconstructed shredded letter, the original note from Mark, and my testimony spanning 2 court dates. A forensic document examiner, a retired FBI agent named Dr. Harmon, confirmed the signature was a traced forgery, matching the indentation pattern on the back of the page to a birthday card found in Renee's possession during a search of her house, the one from Mark to her 5 years prior. A forensic accountant traced the $250,000 through Renee's accounts, finding that over $80,000 had already been spent on the Lexus SUV, high-end electronics from a big-box retailer, credit card debt paydowns, and cash withdrawals at 2 different casinos in the next county. The court ordered full restitution of $275,000, the original sum plus statutory interest at 9%, and punitive damages for willful misconduct. Renee was convicted of second-degree felony exploitation of a dependent adult, a charge that carried a sentence of 5 years in state prison, of which she served 3 before being released on supervised probation with an ankle monitor. Her professional home health aide license was permanently revoked by the state nursing board after a disciplinary hearing where I testified with Callahan present, the board citing gross moral turpitude and a pattern of financial abuse of vulnerable persons. She was added to the federal exclusion list maintained by the Office of Inspector General, barring her from ever working in any healthcare billing or caregiving capacity again. Kyle received 18 months probation for conspiracy to commit fraud, lost his real estate license, and had to complete 200 hours of community service scraping graffiti off highway barriers. Their house, which had 2 liens and a home equity line maxed to the ceiling, was sold at a foreclosure auction, and the leftover proceeds, about $14,000 after the mortgage and lien holders were paid, were applied to the restitution judgment. I didn't gloat, but I did frame the newspaper clipping from the local paper, the one with her mugshot and the headline, "Home Health Aide Convicted of Exploiting Family Trust." The insurance company, after an internal meltdown that led to the firing of 3 claims processors and a settlement with the state insurance commissioner, formally reinstated the policy payout and transferred the full $250,000 into the court-supervised special needs trust, plus an additional $35,000 settlement for their negligence in processing a flagged forged document and violating their own fraud controls. With Callahan's help, I established a comprehensive care plan for Lucas that included a qualified professional caregiver from a bonded agency, an adaptive living fund for specialized communication devices, and a sensory-safe bedroom renovation, a modest monthly allowance for my own respite care, and a legal framework ensuring the trust could never be raided by anyone outside the probate court's oversight. For the first time in 2 decades, I wasn't terrified of the future. I had Mark's foresight to thank for that, and the quiet audacity he'd shown by hiding a note in a lockbox his sister would toss aside like trash, by writing that dead man's switch into a trust that would automatically protect our son's future, even when I was too dazed to see the knife at my back. He had known on some level that Renee was a predator, and he had built an escape route for me from beyond the grave. I still have that lockbox. I keep it in my closet, the note folded inside, a permanent reminder that integrity isn't a passive virtue. It's a skill you sharpen, a lock you learn to pick, a truth you refuse to bury. Some families give you roots, but some members are just weeds. You prune them with legal paperwork, documented evidence, and the steady hand of a woman who knows how to fix a pipe. Pick a filing cabinet and wait. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If you believe that some family ties need to be cut with a lawyer, hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that stories about justice served are exactly what you need. I'll be back next time with another tale of family, betrayal, and the quiet satisfaction of a well-built revenge. Thanks for watching.